Hey team. Now, when was the last time you watched women's sport? Was it by design or was it just because it happened to be on? Because I've been wondering whether the system of Australian sport might actually be working against women's sport and disproportionately favouring men. From the way that broadcast markets are constructed to the way that media attention compounds, the finite amount of money, airtime, and attention that is available in a country of just 26 million people. And honestly, I could even be part of the problem too. A male podcaster in his 40s, mostly talking about men's sport. Because, look, we are all subjected to the same feedback loop: more coverage, more outrage, more analysis, and more content about the same men's sports. Meanwhile, women's sport isn't struggling because of a lack of talent or a lack of interest. But is it being held back by a system that never seems to give it enough oxygen to properly scale? This is a big Moneyball breakdown today with a very special guest to help me do it. So let's get into it, because if you want to know what's really going on in sport, you got to follow the money.
And now it's time.
It's time!
It's time for
Moneyball.
Moneyball.
Are you familiar with the story of Moneyball?
Well, welcome to Moneyball, the business of sport, the show for sports insiders and for fans who want to know what is really going on in sport. I'm your host, Scott Keenan. And let me know in the comments which women's sports that you watch and what do you think might be standing in the way of women's sports going mainstream in this country? Because Australia loves to think of itself as a sporting nation, but what's interesting is which sports that we find ourselves talking about and the ones that we don't. If you look at football or soccer, it's got around 1.9 million participants in this country. Basketball, it's got around 1.3 million. Netball is huge as well, and yet media attention seems to be overwhelmingly concentrated around two big sports, two winter sports, the AFL and the NRL. They dominate broadcast deals, sports radio, podcasts, newspaper coverage, panel shows, social media conversation, and that matters because attention isn't neutral. It drives sponsorship. Sponsorship drives revenue and income to players and to administrators, and that leads to facilities and pathways and participation at the grassroots level as well. Which means that visibility doesn't just shape what we watch, it shapes who gets the opportunities. And in a country of 26 million people where every sport is now fighting for a share of voice and revenue, there is a bigger question here. Is there actually enough money and attention in the Australian sports economy to support everybody? And does the system keep reinforcing the same sports that already dominate while leaving others, including a lot of women's sports, behind? Now, we've got an awesome guest here to break this down today. You might know Dr Bridie O'Donnell from the incredible SBS coverage of the Tour de France. But Dr O'Donnell has also spent years inside Australian sport as an elite cyclist representing Australia, also an elite athlete in two other sports. She's a broadcaster, an administrator, and an advocate for women in sport and gender equality. Now, she's been analysing this issue in a big way, and I wanted to get her on the show to talk about it and ask, is Australian sport built for men and limiting women? Now, Bridie, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me. And I've got to ask you, when did you first start feeling that the balance had tipped too far, that the coverage of men's sports wasn't just about popularity, but something instead that is structurally disproportionate?
Probably the very first time I picked up a newspaper or saw sport on television. It's unavoidable. It's existed because sport was created for men and women are the add-on. It's why the W has been added to AFLW, NRLW, and WNBL, WBBL, W League. So it basically, the message there is the men's version of that activity is the gold standard. And then they go, oh, okay, what about if women played it? We'll put a W on it, and maybe we'll make them different size shorts. We'll make the rules the same, or we'll make the dimensions the same as they are in cycling for handlebars, and hopefully it'll work. And this has been happening probably for the last 20 years, whilst the professionalisation of women's sport has really started to come into people's attention. Because before that, women were really just having to fight to actually participate. We know women were pulled from the Boston Marathon in 1975 when a woman tried to participate. We know that clothing has restricted women from their ability to participate meaningfully in swimming and cricket, etc. Women had to pay. I mean, we've even heard Belinda Clark say that when she represented Australia in the women's cricket team, she had to pay to go overseas to play. The Matildas had to pay to play in the 80s and 90s. So it's been forever. People are so used to seeing male athletes and the stories surrounding men's professional sport dominating that if you took up 2 pages in the back page of the Herald Sun or the Age down here in Victoria, people go, whoa, that's a lot of coverage. Do we need all those stories? And so I think that we've always known this, and any athlete, any professional athlete my age and probably up to 10 years below me would have grown up having male heroes because there were no visible women to admire. And probably me on the Sunshine Coast, the first things I saw other than the LA Olympics on TV were the Kellogg's Nutri-Grain Iron Woman events. So Reen Corbett and Carla Gilbert, those amazing surf Ironman athletes. So they were swimming, paddling. They were the first professional women I saw on TV. And Saturday afternoon, you could watch Wide World of Sport and watch them compete.
When I think back to when I was watching that as a kid as well, that was probably one of the first times where I saw women and men being kind of shown equally in the media. Yes, I watched Trevor Hendy and the boys go around, but seeing some of those women too on a Saturday Arvo on telly, it was normal. And I think that's one of the things that we've got to do a better job of is normalising the way we show and talk about women's sport. I want to pick up on one of the things that you mentioned there, that the slapping of the W onto sports names. The only competition that's really done it well is the A-Leagues. They call themselves the A-Leagues, women and men. And I just think that's an absolute no-brainer. I don't know why we have to talk about NRL and NRLW or AFL and AFLW. It's the same game. It's just played by different gender people.
No, it's not the same game, though. This is the other problem, I think, that, yes, we should call them the same thing. And just to catch you out there, though, they weren't called the A-League women and men until quite recently. They were called the W League.
Yeah, that's true.
So they did call them, men's football and the W League. They even called the women's cricket team the Southern Stars until finally they thought maybe we should just call them the men's cricket team and the women's cricket team. Yep. So again, that's in response to people giving feedback to Cricket Australia and to Football Australia. It's slapping a W on to say, oh, the gold standard is, and we'll continue to cover the men's competition in a certain way, and then we'll let women play. The problem is, though, that there was a catch-22. People wanted to say that women's sport was an add-on, but then they were judging it and determining its merit based on the men's performance being the gold standard. So as we all saw happen at the start of the AFLW in 2017, was that immediately haters and boring men on the internet would say, well, that wasn't very aggressive. She can't jump very high. She can't kick very far. My 14-year-old son can kick further. And they were using the metrics or the performances of male athletes to determine the viability of women's sport. In the same way, we've even heard cycling commentators say that, up until quite recently, that women's racing is boring because it's slower, or that there are fewer attacks. If you have a team of 9 men and they're all young men and they're all flying off the front and it's all televised, of course they're attacking all the time. That's what young men do. They animate the race. It's on TV and the team director's telling them to. Until recently, a lot of women's racing wasn't on TV. You have 6 women in a team, and so you have less athletes and teammates to dispose of, and you don't want them flying off the front and attacking. So there are physiological, logistical, tactical, and even team reasons why women are going to race differently. And until you have a commentator who can explain that to the audience, the lazy observer or fan will just think, well, this doesn't look like men's Paris-Roubaix, or this doesn't look like the men's Tour de France finale, therefore it's not good, instead of thinking, oh, maybe it's just different.
Well, I'm glad I've got you here to help explain and unpack that a little bit today, because I think my hearing you talk about it, my perception is maybe a little bit skewed, because I'm from the eastern, from New South Wales. The main game that I follow is the NRL. You're in southern states, and the main game that you follow is the AFL. I think rugby league is probably one of the games where actually there isn't a lot of difference between the way that the women and men play. The rules are very, very similar. obviously like body shape and the style of play is a little bit different, but the way that people have got around it quite quickly has kind of taken people by surprise a bit. And I think the game itself has caught up with like what the product was that was promised quite quickly. But what I'm seeing is that at the elite level, so State of Origin, which is the really big product, New South Wales against Queensland, it's currently being played over a 3-match series. There's a lot of support behind it, and in fact, the first game of the series was the most watched rugby league game, men or women, on Channel 9 so far this year. So there's a lot of support for it. But one of the things that I'm finding is that it's still not being talked about in the same way as what men's is. And I want to come to this idea that you've been talking about on Instagram and some of your reels lately. It really grabbed my attention. The idea that there are almost more people sort of talking about, you know, the AFL or the NRL than play it professionally. So we've got this big cohort of people who are talking about it. It's becoming concentrated around these sports. But we've also got this like feedback loop where coverage is leading to attention leads to revenue leads to more coverage, and those conversations seem to be shaped more and more around a smaller number of sports, really primarily, you know, cricket in the summer and then the AFL and the NRL in the winter. And one example that I saw just in the last week was Magic Round in Queensland, in Brisbane. It's the NRL's big round where all the games in the men's competition get played at the same stadium. There's also a women's State of Origin game on the Thursday night at the same stadium. But on Fox League's magazine program that's on Monday to Wednesday, Magic Round this weekend, we've got 8 great games coming up, and they showed Friday, Saturday, Sunday, ignored the women's game as part of their conversation. Why is it so hard for women's sport to kind of break into this cycle that was really built decades ago? You know, is women's sport fundamentally just competing against history, or is it competing against other sports? How do we make room for more conversation about women's sports in our media?
Firstly, back to NRLW, it was grown more slowly than any other women's professional league. So they started with just 4 teams, and for a couple of seasons there were just 4 clubs that had a women's team, and now it's grown. And as you've said, huge fan engagement and huge appreciation. There are some nuances about that as a sport. I grew up in Queensland, went to many State of Origin games at Lang Park, barracking, of course, for the best state, which is Queensland.
We can't be friends now.
That's fine by me. What I think that there are things that are very easy about NRL as a sport, or NRLW, whatever you want to call it, in that it's played in a rectangular stadium where the media and the sports coverage of that event is pretty embedded. Cameras know where they need to be, numbers of players, direction of play, the fact that it's in, you know, straight line running and passing across the field. And then we, of course, have had opportunities to film and broadcast rugby union as well in this country. So broadcasters, the people bringing you the sport, the people commentating about the sport, they don't have to change much and evolve much. So that makes it easier for the men to commentate on the women. They just have to learn their names and pronounce them properly, and then make commentary about whether she tackled well or didn't, or what her passes were like, and whether that try was fantastic or why she didn't kick a goal. So I'm not trying to suggest that they're all Neanderthals in the sport of NRL, but what I'm saying, it is a less complex game than AFL, and then, of course, a much less complicated thing than cycling or cricket. Yep. Now, I think in terms of your other question, why is it so hard? Well, sexism, Scott. The patriarchy, Scott. Yep. Like, that's why there are men running networks, there are men running leagues, there are men running everything. And there haven't been many women who have been CEOs of AFL clubs, NRL clubs, or there's not ever been a woman who's been the CEO of the Australian Olympic Committee or a CEO of the NRL or the AFL. There's never been a woman president of the NRL or the AFL. Now, that's not to say that women being in charge would enable the product that is women's sport, because they might think, oh, it's not bringing in the revenue. They might be very commercially focused and not thinking about investment. But in terms of the solution to this problem, you have to be brave. You have to be a person with power, decision-making, and influence, but be willing to disrupt. And the very first example of that, I would suggest, that on a national level, was CommBank's investment in the Matildas And then
Yep.
Football Australia choosing to support a two-nation bid for the FIFA Women's World Cup, which started in about 2018. That team was established, and Jane Fernandez, who's amazing, led the bid for the FIFA Women's World Cup. So in order to disrupt that cycle, that positive feedback loop that we talk about, and for your listeners, just to remind them, positive doesn't mean good, positive means more. More of everything leads to more of everything.
Yeah.
So to disrupt that, you have to be willing to sit down with investors, board members, the network, and say, we're going to spend a lot of money and we're not going to get the same return that we get when we spend a lot of money over here, and here's why. You can see that this is what they're doing at ESPNW, where they have Women's Sports Sundays. They're saying, we're going to invest in the way we present all of the results, and this is in the USA, and there's an absolute glut of sport that you can cover. There are so many amazing athletes, whether it's at the college or the professional level. But they've said, we're going to spend that whole day focused on women's sport, and we're going to make sure the stories we tell, the images we show, the colours we use for the branding, the investment in the commercial benefits of that day and or for the ESPNW and the digital side of that work is going to be good enough that we're going to yield results in a gentle upswing, as opposed to, I need to make money immediately. And then you also build trust. Because what we saw with some of those surveys, I think it was the Red Book survey from about 4 or 5 years ago, people in Australia were asked to rank their favourite sporting teams. And it was based not just on performance, but trust, marketability. Would you want that person, being a role model for your child? And of the top 10 teams, 9 of them were women's teams.
Yeah, wow.
They were the Opals, the Diamonds, the Matildas, the women's cricket team. So there's a market there. Sponsors want to promote them and be associated with them. CommBank did as well and sunk a lot of money in early and are just absolutely yielding the rewards of that investment into the Matildas. And there are, apparently, according to this Deloitte report, there are hundreds of thousands of sponsors who want to get connected to sport. Those dots just need to be brought together.
Yeah, look, I agree. And I mean, in the work that I do in my 9 to 5, we got involved in an NRLW team as the first sponsor that got behind that team. And to me, the benefits are obvious. It's, I think, like we sort of touched on at the start of the conversation, though, there's not as much money in women's sport as men, obviously, and they're not professional sports in the sense that a lot of them, like the NRLW, let's take that as an example, it's not full-time work. It's not full professional pay. It's only for a portion of the year, and they've got to do other jobs and stay fit and do it all on their own dime and their own time, which is...
Can I jump in and challenge you on something? I think we use the word professional sometimes to sort of define something as, I don't do anything else. So yes, a Carlton football player down here could be argued as he's a professional athlete because that's all he does. He's not doing a very good job of it though, is he? Like, they have lost 13 games in the last 14 or whatever, and they've lost a lead, and their coach just got sacked yesterday. And every single sports journalist has been writing about it and talking about it, like the amount of saturation on one coach's departure from one club. So let's be real and say those women are they're professional. They're just probably managing a family as well. Some of them have kids. They might have a partner. They have a part-time job, and they show up on time, train, and perform, and are getting paid. So I think I know exactly what you mean, but we see a lot of lazy athletes sitting around getting paid a lot of cash. That doesn't mean they're professional in what they do.
Look, I agree. I guess I was just getting at pay, right? So they have to support themselves because they're not being paid as the professional athletes that they are. I want to ask you though, do you reckon regular Aussies actually realise how narrow the sports conversation has become?
I think we're at a danger of trying to define what a regular Aussie is. I think too often
someone who's not in the media bubble like you and me, who's not working in sports sponsorship or in commentary teams or executives, people outside of those worlds.
Okay, so everybody basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I don't think that they're not a homogenous group. We're incredibly diverse as a country, And I think sport has also, we talked about whether sport has been designed for men. It's also been designed for white English-speaking able-bodied people who were born here. And yet our country doesn't look like that. We have a huge influx of people who are born overseas or children of people who are born overseas whose approach to sport, the value of sport in the community might be very different to white Anglo-Saxon Australians who say you've got to play cricket or footy on a weekend. If I was to use, again, it's a generalisation, but if I was to use some of my friends from med school whose parents were Vietnamese immigrants, those kids were not encouraged to play sport. It was not a priority. They were my colleagues in med school and they had to get great marks and graduate and become doctors. But they're regular Aussies. There's millions of people whose parents came from Vietnam, India, Sri Lanka, China, etc. And so I actually think we're not being diverse enough when we think about what is the product we're offering people.
Yep.
And is it just sitting down on a couch on a Saturday afternoon and watching our game because our parents or grandparents brought us up? There's a lot of people, a lot of households that just don't do that. So I think we need to be more innovative. And this is why we need people from South Asian heritage or people with disability or people who've had a very different upbringing to be on boards of sporting organisations to say, stop delivering it the same way. Stop having 5 white guys commentating an AFL game. Not only are they 5 white guys, but they're all the same age.
Yeah.
You know, so there's not even any youth perspective or older person perspective or a woman's perspective or a person who's new to the sport. They're really feeding people the same kind of mushy, bland food like you're in an aged care facility, and people are hungry for more diverse flavours.
I couldn't agree more. I think the more variety of types of people of different backgrounds, people of different levels of experience within sport, either as somebody that's played it or, you know, has been an administrator or whatever the case, just enthusiastic of wanting to get involved. I agree. I think that there's a lot more room for that. And, you know, I mean, whether that's in traditional media or whether it's, you know, in new media channels, which, you know, you look at, is it Herway Sports, the young woman who's, you know, really driving ahead with all that stuff, and she's partnered now with ARN Media, and the growth of that just on its own is quite incredible. But it goes directly to the thing that you're talking about there, which is let's see some more perspectives, let's see some different voices, and let's give access to those people so that they can talk about sport in the way that they want to the people that they can connect with. Totally agree about that. You know, we do have more podcasts and social platforms and sports content than ever before. We've talked about the fact that we're not hearing enough diverse stories, and that's somewhere we'd like to see some things happening. But have broadcasters and legacy media, do you think they've become gatekeepers for their own benefit?
Yeah, of course they have, because it suits them. And I think also in this country and probably in others, we determine merit based on experience, as in the sport.
Yep.
And when people talk to me about merit, I remind them that merit stands for mates, elevated regardless of intellect or talent. We hire the people we know, we hire the people we like. Of course we do. And so I think of the fact that we don't have very many women calling the play-by-play of AFL down here.
Yeah.
If a woman was to go to a network and say, I've been watching it, calling it at home, and here's my audition tape, and she was brilliant, they would still say, yeah, but you've never played a game. And you've got Macca, Wazza and Andrew and Gary over here who've kicked 50 goals for him, and he's a Coleman medalist and he's a Norm Smith medalist, as though there's a queue. And that if you gave the job to that person over there who may be really good at it, whether they're a man or a woman, if they haven't kicked the 50 goals or won the medal, they're deemed to be unqualified. And I'm sure it's the same in basketball and baseball and NFL over in the United States. And it's understandable. It's totally understandable. The network is going to want a name. They're going to say, here is X. He or she won this particular event. They are a green jersey winner from the Tour de France. They've won a gold medal at the Olympics. Totally get that, because the audience wants to be inside the mind of a champion and have that champion present the sport to them. For example, we've got Grace Brown joining our commentary team at SBS for the last 12 months since her retirement. She's amazing. The things that she can add to the commentary are fantastic. But that's also because she's good at it.
Yeah.
And so,
because I think people want to be entertained as well, right? Like, and people who can bring that and bring different perspectives. I agree. I don't think necessarily because you've played at an elite level and you've won the medal. It shouldn't necessarily qualify. I think you've also got to be a good person that can connect and tell a story too.
And I think cycling is such a unique sport to commentate because, as you found, when you watch it, you have to talk to what's on the camera, on the pictures. You can't just go off on a tangent about something because the audience is watching the peloton move along. But also on a stage of the Tour de France, it must last 6 hours. And it's live, and there's no formula the way there might be in another type of sport. So you have to be prepared for anything, and you have to make sure you are encouraging and supporting your co-commentators. You don't want to be repeating the things they say. You don't want to be not listening and just saying it again, or mansplaining or womansplaining the things to the audience. But your point about gatekeeping is a really important one. I think for a long time, sports like cycling liked being very complex. It's it's a game of strategy on two wheels. It's so hard you wouldn't understand it.
Formula One's the same.
Yeah, and what I'm finding now is I'm trying to make it accessible to anyone and everyone. And I think about people like my mum or friends of the family who say, I don't really understand it. And I go, hey, no problem. Whatever question you want to ask us, we can explain it either on air or later. And Simon's great at that as well, like helping people be in the peloton and understand, why are they doing it that way? Like the number one question we always get asked is, how do the riders go to the toilet while they're riding? And, we keep saying the words nature break and the camera moves off and people are like, yeah, but what's happening? Tell us.
Yeah, and I think we've got to keep breaking down those barriers, right, and getting people involved in sport no matter what way it is. And Australia is not a big country, right? We're 26 million people and there's a limited number of media businesses that are available to broadcast all of these leagues and events. You at the SBS with the Tour de France, but also, other sports too that we've talked about a little bit. Sponsorship too, you've talked about the fact that, there are sponsors out there that do want to get involved in women's sport and are doing that. There's been some great examples recently, Mecca doing a lot with women's sport with, making I guess, themselves visible to sports like the tennis and the Formula One, where women are increasingly going to. The Iconic, the retailer sponsoring an NRLW team, which is great. But I wonder, so much of it is driven by broadcast money. Do you think there's actually enough money and attention in the Australian market to sustain the ambitions of all of the competitions? And I'm not necessarily just talking about men versus women. Obviously, that's the topic at hand. But the idea that all sports can keep pushing for more and more and more revenue from broadcasters to fund their ambitions.
Well, certainly I think we're already seeing some of those deals are plateauing. The deal that Netball Australia is alleged to have signed for the broadcast of the Super Netball. I don't know the numbers, but people are saying it's not more than last time and it could be even a bit less. So there's going to be some on free to air and some on 9 and Fox of the games. We're seeing a feud playing out between NBL titans Larry Kesselman and President Trump's ambassador to New Zealand, who owns the Perth Wildcats, and they're bickering about governance, but you get the sense that this is also a little bit about how the sport of the NBL men's basketball should be promoted. We also saw very quietly the WNBL CEO, who'd only been in the job for a year, she resigned, or they restructured and they didn't need her anymore. I mean, they put out this big call, and the woman who is the chair of Tesla, who is also the chair of the WNBLs, was sort of like, we're going to grow this. It's going to be the biggest league outside of the WNBA, and it's going to be amazing. And then a year later, they don't need a CEO anymore, and they've just appointed Lauren Jackson as a sort of operational person, strategy person, to work closely with the NBL. But that says to me that people are struggling to find the money they need, and the growth is not happening at the rate that they were hoping. Now, we can all argue also as well with what's going on in the world. The way investment is being targeted, sport is definitely a nice to have. It's not an essential for us to live, even though you and I might think that it is essential for us to live. And so it's understandable that investors are being a bit more cautious. There's less disposable income. So I think it's up to major leagues to ask themselves, what's in their strategic plan? Why does growth need to look the same? And also, maybe there are other KPIs around what success looks like. So, for example, we talked about trust. I think brands also want to have trust and reliability. an organisation, a sponsor, doesn't want to sponsor a team where athletes are arrested for drink driving regularly, or where athletes are arrested for violence or sexual assault. That's not cool for them. Their name is there on that jersey. And we know now that sports, I think, but I want to be associated with women's sport because there's a greater trust factor and a greater accessibility and a role model for my children. So I think that sports just need to think differently. If we were to look at the way some of the politicians campaign these days, they rely on a high volume of lower quantum sponsors rather than some big philanthropic donor. And, you know, for cycling, I think everyone's probably nervous in the industry in Australia about Jerry Ryan. I mean, he has propped up Australian cycling for probably two decades. I don't mean that it would have failed without him, but he is an incredibly generous philanthropic donor, and of course established the Green Edge brand to start a men's and then a women's team. But his legacy might not last the same forever, and in 10 or 15 years, his children might say, where do we want to redirect the JCO money? And cycling will have to think differently, and the institutes of sport or academies of sport will have to think differently as well.
Who do you think, question without notice, who do you think, is anybody doing it well at the moment? Anybody, are there any, I guess, sports that are investing well in women's infrastructure, in women's competitions? Do you think there are some doing it better than others?
I'm not working in any clubs and don't have an insider knowledge, so I'm sure there is great work being done everywhere. But it might not be happening at the scale that it needs to.
Yep.
And it also may not be happening in a coordinated way. Sometimes, and we've seen this when I worked in the Office for Women in Sport and Recreation, we saw a similar thing happen where if you had one sort of champion in a club that was really driving participation of girls or boys, you know, changing the way a club needed to be, that champion might be doing amazing work. They're a diversity and inclusion officer or they're a membership person and they're really driving things, and then they leave. So there's a lot of person-dependent roles in community sport and probably similar in professional sport. I'd probably point to the name escapes me, the franchise in the US that's a women's professional soccer team.
Yep, in LA.
Thank you, in LA, yes. That is a model, an ownership model that's distributed. So there are multiple owners. They're all high net worth individuals, but who are celebrities, women celebrities mainly, and people like Natalie Portman. There's been a huge investment by a lot of other women musicians into their country of origin. We saw that at a World Cup. So Jamaica, for example, the Jamaican women's team, a majority owner was, I believe, the daughter or granddaughter of Bob Marley. So.
Yeah, right.
I think what we're seeing is women who are high net worth are starting to invest, and same with rugby. There's a couple of very wealthy Asian sponsors of women's rugby in the US and the UK. So it's more affordable to buy a women's team. You don't need to be a billionaire to run an NFL team. You just need to be a multimillionaire. And, you know, you get connected the way we see, you know, the character of Rebecca Welton in Ted Lasso, or the character that played by Kate Hudson in, you know, Running Point, that great show on Netflix about the NBA. There are women like that in the sport in the US. I think we're seeing more and more of them here in Australia, but they're still coming up against what we call, you know, the glass ceiling or the grass ceiling, which is they're never staying long in leadership positions as CEOs. The media gives them a horrible time, the way they give most women in leadership a horrible time, whether it's Julie Bishop or Julia Gillard. Media loves to pile on women when they're in charge of things. And then women would probably say, why would I do it? Why would I stick around and be the CEO or the chair if I'm going to get the Herald Sun or the Daily Mail writing horrible hack pieces about me every other week?
Yeah, there's one that sticks in my mind, and I can see her face, and I'm struggling to remember her name, but she was the CEO of the Bulldogs in the NRL about 10 years ago.
Raylene Castle.
That's it, I knew it was Raylene.
And then she became the Rugby Australia CEO, and the media just absolutely pilloried her. She now runs sport in New Zealand. She's incredibly popular and she's grown sport over there. Raylene Castle is an absolute legend.
Yeah, and she had a great track record before she came into that Bulldogs role. And I just think the way that she was treated by the media at the time. The club also was in like a difficult spot and wasn't performing, which doesn't help. Yeah, she never got a fair run of it, and it was a shame to see her kind of move out of Australia so quickly. I'm a little bit conscious of like my own position in this, especially when you think about the echo chamber and that positive loop that you were mentioning earlier. You know, I host a sports business podcast. I just got started this year, but so far most of my coverage has focused on men's sports. Even when I've tried to engage with some women's sports, like reaching out to Netball Australia to talk about their new broadcast deal with Nine, it was not easy to get a response from them. I haven't had a response from them. I'd love to talk to them. I think we've all got a role to play, but you know, am I participating in the same imbalance that we're talking about here, even unintentionally?
By your existence, maybe. I mean, yeah, most sports podcasts, more than 85% of sports podcasts are hosted by men. But so just have more women guests on. And I think, you know, by even just we all need to acknowledge our privilege where we can to sort of work out, okay, what do I need to maybe try and do differently, open the door, because I've got heaps of privilege too. You know, I'm English speaking, white, able-bodied, tertiary educated. I'm a medical doctor. I've been an elite athlete in 3 sports. So I feel comfortable in a room, maybe asking some questions or speaking out. Lots of people don't. They'd think, I'd worry about getting selected for my sport, or I'm a lot younger. You know, as we get older, we care less about what people think about us. So we often, that comes with some power and privilege too, doesn't it? So I think it's a great question you're asking yourself. And I think having athletes, women athletes on, but also people to talk about the codes that they represent, or the leagues or the community clubs, and back to your pathway conversation. I think it's really easy with Brisbane 2032 Olympics and Paralympics just around the corner, as we keep saying, 6 years away, to kind of, people keep talking about this green and gold runway. They started talking about it when we got the Olympics secured, so 10 years out. I'm not necessarily seeing that we are growing our participation in a way that we would like. We're still seeing a great example is that the Canberra United women's A-League team is looking precarious, like it might fold.
Yeah, right.
Now, how is this possible 3 years after a World Cup, when Football Australia had their legacy document that they published, and they said we're going to have more girls playing soccer than ever before, and yet football, ACT football, Football Australia haven't been able to rescue this club, which has won multiple A-League premierships, to my understanding.
Yeah, and they've got Matildas in that team as well. And yeah, like you say, it's pretty crazy that we haven't got, you know, I mean, even football doesn't have a home in this country, women or men. So there are some questions about infrastructure and about pathways as we head towards the Olympics. Absolutely. To wrap things up, you know, we're here on a podcast. You know, the patriarchy and the traditional media, we've got to keep challenging them because they're going to do what they're going to do. But what do you think, you know, people with phones in their hands and podcasters and content creators and, you know, advocates like yourself, what do these independent voices and media, what responsibility do they have? What can they do, you know, when we're also operating, you know, within that bigger landscape where there is that kind of repetition of all the same stuff by all the same old blokes?
I think it's about continuing to create the content that they want to, but it shouldn't be the responsibility of a fan to be on the top of the Mur de Huy and live tweeting footage of the Women's Tour of Flanders as they come past because the cameras aren't showing it yet, you know. So I think we need agitators and disruptors. And we also need more people who have a more modern approach working in industry and legacy media. I mean, I think even just this idea of buying a newspaper and reading the articles the next day, that's evolving and changing very rapidly, isn't it? And people are consuming so much disruptive and digital media on their phones and devices, sometimes 2 or 3 sports at a time, and consuming interviews with athletes, and also sports are controlling what they display. So I think we're even seeing a shift in how much access a newspaper or a television channel gets to an athlete. Now the team is saying, we'll do the interview, thanks very much, and then we'll sell you that segment or we'll post it ourselves. So suddenly sports are taking a little bit of that power back instead of having to front up to a press conference and sit there and get hammered. So I think that we are going to see some of the legacy media slowly lose a little bit of their grip on things. And I think what we're seeing is that it's not just women's sport has disrupted things, but it is showing people that content can be meaningful, engaging, dynamic. The stories that can be told about the athletes can be really interesting, and people can get into that. So I would encourage, your viewers and listeners to think about who do I follow on social media? And am I following teams or leagues? Am I following ESPNW? And am I following the Female Athlete Project hosted by Chloe Dalton, which is an amazing podcast and startup that she's begun? And FTG, the For the Girls podcast. Get more of those collaborators. Perhaps you could get them on your show and talk about the things that are important to both of you.
Definitely. And I think you're right, like being more thoughtful about what we go after and what we consume. So not just relying on what is being fed to us, but actually being thoughtful about going after some different voices and some different ways of receiving information and content about the sports that we all love. Hey, thanks so much for your time and for being on the show. You've really made me think a lot about this. You grabbed my attention with those videos that you posted talking about these issues. You do it in such a thoughtful way, and like I say, you certainly made me think. So I appreciate your time today and for sharing some of those ideas here on Moneyball.
Thanks so much, Scott. It's a real pleasure.
Moneyball.
All right, team, hit me up in the comments on this one. Really keen to know what you think and to get your reactions to that really thoughtful conversation with Dr Bridie O'Donnell. One thing is for sure, in my opinion, we've got a long way to go, haven't we? Because it's not enough just to support our swimmers at the Olympics or the Matildas once every 4 years. Women absolutely have a right to carve out a professional paid career from sport, just like men have for a long time. And the structures and the media that support the system that we've had in place for a long time, it's got to change because the system is working against them. That's pretty clear. So what can we do? Well, vote with your feet, go to the games, seek out other views and opinions and other shows and content. Watch women's sport on TV and tell the media and the content creators that you love and that you follow that you want them to cover women's sport as well, and you want them to be a voice for change in the future too. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe for more breakdowns of the business of sport. You can follow the show on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've got a question for me here on the show, you can email anytime. askmoneyball.show@gmail.com. And remember, if you want to know what's really going on in sport, you got to follow the money. Thanks for watching and listening, and I'll see you on the next one.